data shows this has seen their families benefit from the strong dollar and strengthening of other major foreign currencies such as the British pound and euro. The shilling weakened by 19.5% in the year to July against the dollar and exchanged at an average of 144 shillings on Friday, according to the Central Bank of Kenya, a new record low. But several large banks are now selling the dollar at up to 150 shillings, with bankers and forex bureaus saying the higher prices have been driven by demand and the cost of accessing the hard currency. Okay, and the rush to take advantage of a strong dollar by Kenyans in the diaspora is therefore stretching and boosting the purchasing power of their local beneficiaries amid slump in the shilling, in turn triggering a remittance boom. Okay, and latest data from CBK shows remittances surged to 54 billion shillings last month alone, up from 49 billion shillings in June. Let's take a look at the Star, and I can only say shocking. Are education officials trading on girls' periods? Medics warn poor quality could cause infections, skin irritations, and worsen stigma. The details are this: audit reveals pads of poor quality and could easily fall off. A concern, major concern, especially because as the Nation Media Group, we undertook to end stigma and period poverty at an event. And yeah, so subject close to anybody. I mean, close to anybody's heart. Anybody who has a daughter, a mother, or a sister. Also on the front page here of the Star, wild animals are feasting bodies buried at Langata Cemetery. That is MPs being quoted there. Let me just flip to page 7 here and get a bit more detail on that. Page 7, this is 3, 4, 5 here. We should be about here. Let me see this one by Julius Otieno. Legislators claim thieves are also exhuming the dead, stealing coffins at the graveyard. Wild animals are mutilating human bodies buried in shallow graves at the filled-up Langata Cemetery as thieves steal coffins, MPs have said. The lawmakers said the dead are not resting in peace as the animals are feasting on their bodies every night, thanks to City Hall and the Ministry of Health's inaction to relocate the site. We bury our dead in shallow graves and expose them to be mutilated by wild animals. Quoted here is Rangwe MP Lilian Gogo. The African culture is to the extent that it respects the dead. It is unfortunate that when we expect our dead to rest, they do not, and instead their bodies are mutilated by wild animals. Okay. I will leave that there. What else is on the front page here of the Star? Really quickly, I say I have about 3 minutes to be done with this. An image here, the editorial cartoon. Also on the front page of the Standard, Ruto sends mixed signals as bipartisan talks resume. And stories on the side here that we covered in our top stories. Okay, I will leave that there. Let's take a look finally at the People Daily. Hiring scams, KDF bosses put on the spot. Aiden Duale, CS Defense, quoted as saying, I asked this House to judge myself, General Ogola, and the entire leadership of KDF on this recruitment. Recruitment fraud, at least 25 officers on trial or under probe over jobs scandal ahead of next month's drive to hire soldiers. More on page 4 of the People Daily. Omanyala meets his match at World Event. TLC invites unions for talks on teachers' pay, and an image here of England's pain as they fall to Spain in World Cup final. Prof, you were asking me who I was supporting, and I told you due to social media, I knew that England's team, at least I knew they're called the Lionesses. I should probably be more aware and more supportive of the sport, Women's World Cup.
If they were called Lions.
Sorry, who were called Lions?
Yeah, they would have won.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so let's get into the topic of conversation. And this morning, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the state of the economy, stabilizing the economy, debt, inflation, and the dollar. In your view, Professor XN Iraqi, are we now on sound economic footing?
It depends on who you ask. Because if you ask any politician, he'll probably say we're on the south track. Because as a politician, it's always important to make sure that your voters are happy. But the panel sitting here should be more objective. So if you have to say the economy is on the right track, we have to give data and evidence. So if you look at the three ideas you brought here, debt, I think there has been a sustained effort by the Kenya Kwanza government to stabilize debt, to borrow less. But one of the stories I found in the Business Daily says that when the Treasury tried to auction some bonds, the buyers demanded 18%. I think.
Yes.
So they were saying this is not good enough. So clearly, the government seems to be saying if you cannot get these bonds at less interest rate, you can leave them. And that's a clear indicator that the government is still getting some debt because they're not able to support all its obligations. If you look at inflation, I think the latest data shows that inflation has stabilized. It's not going up as much as expected. But I think the soft underbelly of the government, of the Kenyan economy, is the exchange rate. It has really suffered because of the rising dollar. So things seems to be stabilizing, but not as much as expected. But the best way to ask whether the economy is doing very well is not to ask this panel. It's to go on the streets of Nairobi and ask people, are you better off or not better off?
We did ask them. I'll look at some of the feedback they've given us.
So if they say they are feeling good and they're seeing good prospects, I think I would believe them more than this panel here because they have become.
But you shop as well, Prof.
Yes.
You sustain a household.
But you see, where I go to shop and where the people on the street shop are sometimes different, and what we buy sometimes different. But I believe the people who tell you whether the economy is doing well or not are the people on the lower echelons of the society because they have no savings. They live from day to mouth. So they are more realistic than us. So I would like to hear the feedback from them. But from my gut feeling, I think the worst is over.
You think the worst is over? Phew. Abraham, are you as optimistic?
I don't think the worst is over yet because of two main reasons. The first one is that a lot of what we consider our economy, especially consumptive goods, save basic, your usual food, cabbages, potatoes, and the rest. A lot of it is still imported. And that importation then drives
cabbages.
I'm saying save for things like cabbages, potatoes. A lot of the maize we are consuming is still imported. Another basic stuff that we are using at the household level is still imported. And as long as the dollar remains high, then the cost of those goods. But two is the cost of energy. I think for me that's the most concerning part. When you look at all of us buy tokens, at least me I have an experience. I don't know whether Prof buys.
My friend, I don't have a personal grid.
Maybe you have solar panels.
Prof might be running on solar panels. But I think when you look at the cost of electricity, it's still very high. It's still, in fact, I think it's getting higher and higher. The cost now has gone slightly lower than the last, I think, 2-3 months, but still significant. You know, when you see how much, every 100 shillings gives you in terms of tokens, that's. But the cost of fuel, petroleum, even if it did not shoot up, whether it was stabilized or it was subsidized, is another story. At 195 shillings per liter, that has meant that you have the cost of every other aspect of a product going up, the cost of transportation, and I think there's a business story here saying VAT is going down. VAT is your best measure of how much consumption is happening. There was also another story about the consumption of sugar and milk actually going down, I think sometime last week. For me, those are the things that start telling you, either this was meant to cause some good behavior change from sugar, but my read is that we still perhaps are still a bit into, into the tight spot, as it were. Concerted efforts, especially for local production of food and more consumption of what we produce, perhaps will be the game changer. But as long as we still, there's still effort towards importation of oils and other basic stuff that we use, my sense is that perhaps we are going to be in this through Christmas. Okay.
I remember we're chatting, Professor Kalunda, and you're saying, it's too soon to be making such declarations that the economy has stabilized. Why did you take that view?
Yeah, so thank you, Olive, and also I want to appreciate what my presenters have said. Yeah, so one thing I can say is that it's a bit too early to talk about the economy and the change, because we have normally the transmission period. So there's normally a lag between when some things happen and when the effect is being felt. But if you look at what is currently happening from an inflation point of view, I will not really say that we are out of the reds, because if you look at the very basic products that we use, like sugar, like unga, the prices are still higher. You can go to the supermarkets, you'll see we don't have unga for ugali at 100 shillings. So we can say actually the normal basket of a normal Kenyan has gone down. And then the issue of fuel has been mentioned, so let me not say more about that. And then also let's not forget about the Finance Act. It was implemented, and the current month, we are going to have less disposable income. So meaning we'll not be able to buy as many things as we are buying before. And then as I was following what the CS National Treasury was saying, he actually said that in case we are not able to meet our targets, they are going to revise the levies and the taxes anytime. And in October, they'll be bringing a paper to have probably increases to meet up the deficits that are there. So for me, I wouldn't say really things are good. And I think last month, we had so many companies closing down giving notices of job losses. So I wouldn't really say that we are anywhere good. And maybe just lastly on this, some areas, up to now, the harvest was bad. I come from Ukambani. We never got a harvest. So when I hear people saying that there's a bumper harvest, sometimes I'm wondering what exactly is this, because most areas actually did not get a good harvest. So I would say inflation, still a bit too early for the effect to be felt by the common mwananchi. Yeah.
All right. Although I saw that it was... at least it came down, right? The inflation rate as of July.
7.3, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the rate, yeah.
And is it you, Abraham, I think, who referenced
yes.
consumption?
Yeah.
Consumption of sugar and milk dropping, yeah, by huge margin. This was filed on Saturday by The Nation, filed by, in particular, Peter Mboro. Sugar consumption in Kenya dropped by 42% between January and June, a reflection of households foregoing or cutting down on the use of the sweetener. At the same time, January and May recorded levels of milk, the lowest levels of milk consumption in the last 3 years. Maize and wheat imports also dropped by 36% and 20% respectively, comparing the half-year periods of 2023 and last year. And this is despite the poor production of the two crops last year, and points to the toll the high cost of living has taken on Kenyan families. Data on milk intake in the formal sector by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics shows that the period covering January to May, consumption was at 299.7 million litres, down from 323.6 million during a similar period last year. So I don't know what you make of this, Wangare. We are told that inflation has gone down, but then again, we're also reading that Kenyans are foregoing certain items, because while the cost of gas, cooking gas may have come down, what do I call it, LPG? Yeah, cost of LPG may have come down. The cost of onions is high, cost of sugar is high, but some of these factors, I suppose, could be informed by things outside our control. Your thoughts?
So I agree with the panelists that have spoken earlier in terms of the economy moves in different ways, right? And there are different levers that the government uses. The private sector also, intervenes. Households that actually determine the movement of the economy. When the central bank increased the interest rate, I think that had some effect, because it has served to control inflation to the degree that it mopped up a lot of the liquidity in the market. And of course, as everybody knows, when there's a lot of money, people spend a lot, and that sends the inflation higher, which inflation, as we all know, means the prices go higher, and sometimes at a fast rate, sometimes at a lower rate. And if they go up too fast, and if you don't have a similar increase in your household income, then it becomes more expensive for you to afford your day-to-day expenses. So I think the intervention by the central bank has had some effect. I do agree that you did need some time to see it, to actually definitively say that it has had that effect. But when you look at the food, the inflation effects, you see it has a lot to do with the food basket. Yeah? So the inflation is based on the CPI, which is a consumer price index, which is depends on a basket of goods that has been identified, and you measure the increase in the prices in that basket of goods over the months and over years to see how high has a price risen. And if you look at the food component, so it has different components: housing, transport, and food, right, and others. When you look at the food component, it is actually it is what has brought inflation down. I think there was discussion about the harvest and the question about the harvest, but I do think the rains came through better than they have come through before. And I see we're seeing that in the food basket. But if you look at the housing and the transportation basket, the non-food items, you see matatu fares have gone up by a very high amount. I think was like 17%. All the petrol, like diesel, petrol, I think kerosene has also gone up, and those are basic energy needs in the household and for household purposes. And so you do see that there are some inflationary pressures still in non-food items, whereas in food it may have gone down. So it is a balancing act. You know, if we do have a bad harvest, a bad food season, we may see inflation go up again, right? So I think it's a delicate balance. I do think there have been good effects from the CBK push, the increase in interest rates, but we are also subject to things like importation. You know, we import a lot of stuff,
yes,
right? We import even our own foods, like the vegetable oils, petroleum, we import wheat, we import. So if we're still having a high dollar exchange rate, and if this, you know, we always talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, and people are like, what does that have to do with us? But of course, you know, it has to do with us because it has disrupted the supply chains. So if that continues to happen, we still are subject to the vagaries of what is happening in the global environment. The US is also mopping up its dollars, so the dollars are in lower supply. And so as much as we may be trying to stabilize things in-house, we are still subject to a global environment that is causing more inflationary pressures.
All right, speaking of government interventions, I should make a note of this. At 8 a.m., the president is set to launch KNTC's Mama Pima edible oil dispensing machines. Chief guest, Kenyan President William Ruto, Indonesian President Joko Widodo. The event will be held at the Deputy County Commissioners in Dagoretti, Nairobi County, 8 a.m. This is my e-invite card. Maybe you can take a screenshot. Prof, when we talk about the state of the economy and whether it is stable or it is not stable, what are the indicators? What are we looking at?
I think the first observation I need to make is if you listen to what the response from the two gentlemen, from the two ladies, you can see they are more realistic. They are more attentive to details than us. I don't know whether you are very keen.
Wait, the ladies are more attentive to detail.
Yes, like us.
Okay.
Us, we talk of big things. We talk of big things. And I think one of the things that has come out from this discussion is that I seem to be very lonely here. I'm the only optimist. But I'm a cautious optimist. I think the reason why the inflation and other things are going down could be that people don't have money to spend. So if you don't have money to spend, there's the demand for goods and services go down. The prices go down. But there are a number of ways we can... there are a number of factors we can look at if we are trying to find out whether the economy has stabilized. So the first one is look at the growth in inflation I said earlier. So if the inflation is going up or down, it is stabilizing. If you look at the exchange rate, that is the bad part of it. It's really doing badly. And you saw one of the stories here where people are celebrating the diaspora remittance have gone up.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. The dollar is very strong. So if you send money here, it converts into more Kenyan shillings.
Yes. And
it gives an impression that you are doing very well. So apart from that, the other one is the debt. How is our debt doing? I think the government has been very reluctant to incur more debt. Now, some people have been saying that that was one of the single objective of Kenya Kwanza government, that we are going to stop borrowing. But I think they are still borrowing. Look at the rising rate of interest that is being offered to treasury bills and treasury bonds. But I think the ultimate measure of how the economy has stabilized or not we should be asking is the economic growth rate. So if you compare last year and this year, I think the economy is not growing as fast this year as last year. So maybe you're waiting for the final data at the end of the year. But from the look of things, things are not as fast as expected. But again, I'll keep on saying the most important determinant is the people on the streets. They are the majority. They are the people who consume. And they are the people whose sentiment should be factored in when we are saying whether the economy is doing well or not.
Okay.
Finally, I am not very happy with the way the rains are behaving. I was in a countryside recently, and the rains are not doing very well. So if the rains don't perform as expected, then I expect some inflationary pressures to come up. But the most important thing we are forgetting is that our economic direction is very much influenced by the politics. So since we don't have any demos so far, since the political divides are talking to each other, if they come up with something good that is going to make us peaceful for the next several years, then I expect the economy to pick up. I don't support any of the political directions. I simply support political sense, and I sense it is prevailing.
A political sense, okay. Abraham, you know, you brought in, you raised some concern with regard to, it's like we're making our decisions based on what will, I don't want to say satisfy, but appease or, you know, the IMF. Why are you concerned about that?
I think IMF plays a very critical role in the world economy because one, the fact that we have borrowed money from them, the fact that they play, you know, a stabilization role through the different instruments that they use in economies across the world. I think IMF plays a critical role. What I'm not convinced is that Kenya at this day and age should be fully dependent on the direction of IMF. You see a lot of IMF, you know, we've turned around because IMF is not happy. IMF is happy because we've increased all the taxes that we signed, regardless of what impact that those taxes are having on the economy. And I put this on record because we have raised this with the IMF at the country office here and said, guys, you see, the fact that the conditions you have signed are being, you know, ticked one after another. If you listen to the budget speech, I think it's the budget speech where there was the biggest mention of IMF ever that I've listened. That for me is concerning because what the taxes are doing to a population where incomes are not increasing. Let's remember that how much government raises in taxes is a factor of the incomes of the population. So in a situation where incomes are not going up, inflation, whereas it has stabilized, let's not forget that it actually has gone up. You know, so it's gone up but stabilized. So it's a plateaued, you know, if you were to argue that. And that drives the cost of living. So my concern is that as a country, we should also use what makes sense for our economy, you know, at this particular time, so that it's not just a tick kind of box. You know, the Finance Act now being implemented is not only creating less disposable income to the many people, but it's also making business people make very tough calls. People are saying, perhaps we need to lay off staff. And it came at a time when employment opportunities were not necessarily increasing, were not necessarily improving, you know, as it were. So for me, I wanted just to add one thing, that one, I think as a government, as a country, we need to make a bit more of our own decisions. I think what we want to, you know, to see, because even this stabilization between, you know, the role that CBK, the Central Bank of Kenya, plays, and the role that the Treasury plays is extremely critical, as it were. So that's my concern, that IMF cannot be the sole driver of the kind of economic policies that we make. But let me add 2 points that perhaps are related to that. One is that we discuss this almost like only a revenue problem. So government is trying to raise more revenue.
Yes.
But why are we not discussing the expenditure side of things? You know, why are we not talking about the fact that government is still spending as though it's business as usual, as though everything is normal? You're seeing a few cuts here and there, but still spending is not necessarily reducing, because at this particular time, one had expected, you talked about the 2.9 trillion that we expect to raise this year. One had expected actually a reduction in the expenditure side of government. So it cannot only be a revenue-driven discussion. So the whole language around fiscal consolidation, which is basically about reduce your expenditure, now that raising revenues is almost becoming, you know, is reaching some plateau of sorts. But secondly, is that we still are running institutions we are not quite clear on what to do with them. And these are the state-owned corporations. Allow me to bring this up because it has come up.
You raised it earlier.
Yeah, I raised it earlier, but I wanted to discuss it a bit more. State-owned corporations account for about a third or 28% or thereabout of our budget every year. When you look at the transfers that we make to different institutions, I know we talk about the big ones, Kenya Ports Authority, Kenya Power, Kenya Airways, and all this that we keep bailing out and paying their debts regardless of whether they are performing or not. That still remains a black hole. It's been part of a review after review after review after review. The IMF conditionality has a lot of aspect of what to do with these state corporations. Either privatize them. Some of them need either to be completely sold out and we forget about them. But at 300, I think they are now, last check I did was about 343 of them. Different institutions that do different, different things in the different ministries. At a time when we have a devolved system of government, so you have county governments, you have national government. Just take the sector of water, for instance, or let me use agriculture, where you created the AFA, the Agriculture and Food Authority, that was supposed to amalgamate all these boards and institutions, but the boards still continue operating, independently. I think for me, as we discuss the question around what to do with our expenditure, these institutions are supposed to raise revenue, their own revenue, in terms of spending. But as long as we are not discussing what kind of expenditures we are incurring and whether there is value for money from those kind of expenditures, I think we'll keep going round. Raise more taxes, introduce more levies, introduce more taxes, and in a place where citizens are asking, but at what cost? For what? For me, those are the things.
All right, but where the state-owned corporations are concerned, if you consider the sugar companies, there's a lot of politics usually involved. Kenya Airways, it's the national carrier. So there are many factors usually which come into play. But we get the thoughts of Professor Elizabeth Kalunda as well as Wangari Mukia, expertise global on the other side of this break.
In your paper this week, future of East African Mission in Congo in doubt. Kinshasa continues to sign bilateral defense deals as a plan B in the run-up to September expiry of regional forces mandate. Kinshasa banks on bilateral troop deals to secure its defenses in eastern flank. Plus our opinion leaders, the allure of the land in Botswana, Charles Onyango Obo. Betting beats education in access. That's a bad thing. LC Eakuze. If SGR is so important, why can't Kenyans and Ugandans pay for it? Joaquim Buembo. Magazine. African women are World Cup's biggest winners. For these and more stories, get your copy of the East African.
Yo, Butrus aka the Sharp God up in the mix, and I'm saying NTV, shout out to you, bro. Keep it locked. Hey.
Sauti yako ina sound vizuri kwenye masikio.
I like it. Come to the dance floor, babe.
Angie.
Leo tuna festa banda. Festa banda. Another banda. And it's just like an amazing mix.
I am happy today. Sin koma vitu nanilea.
Inaweka shida chini na tupa mikono juu. Banjuka tu.
No compromise, this the hottest combo.
Unistima, uninare. On NTV, don't touch that dial. Not yet. No, what?
Benefits of ordering with Glovo. Glovo allows you to order anything you want at the comfort and convenience of your home. Craving fried chicken or pilau or pizza? Easy and simple. Order on Glovo today. Glovo, order anything, we deliver in minutes. With Glovo you order anything unataka and when you get it una celebrate because kukuchoma imefika na wakati keki inafika ndio sherehe inaanza. Order Glovo will deliver in minutes.
All right, welcome back to AM Live. We're looking at the state of the economy at present. Professor Elizabeth Kalunda, you know, Abraham has painted a picture of you know, us, Kenya, being like, you know, a puppet on strings that, in IMF's hands. But is it that we're in between a rock and a hard place? Because while the president may tell us that we will pay off, you know, there was the Eurobond. What do I call it?
Redemption.
Chokehold.
Redemption.
Yeah. Like we knew it was coming in the near future, and there was some concern about that. But he says we will be able to pay that off ahead of schedule. So for him, that indicates that the economy is now in a good place. But now, when I listened to Meg Whitman's speech, presentation I should call it, at the Devolution Conference, she did raise some concern about Kenya's debt, or Kwa Uchumi has raised the same concern, if I can just quote from them here. Unlike Tanzania, which has maintained public debt as a percentage of GDP below the 50% threshold from 2013 to 2022, Kenya's public debt as a percentage of GDP has increased in the same period from 39.76% to 67.94% in 2022. Arguably, the expansionary fiscal policy, which is primarily driven by massive infrastructural spending in the last decade, together with the IMF's debt limit policy initiative, and you'll tell us what that is, which sets and frequently revises the maximum threshold for debt a country can accumulate, continues to drive Kenya's debt crisis to its current unsustainable levels. Also, the structural adjustment conditionalities that IMF imposes through its debt policy frameworks, including ECF and EFF frameworks, have inadvertently contributed to the debt crisis in Kenya and Africa. The implication of this has been decreasing investment in critical development areas such as education, healthcare, and the social well-being of the citizens. This has resulted in increased regressive tax measures that have led to low job creation opportunities and reduced income for the citizens. Are we still in a debt crisis?
Okay, thanks, Oli, for that. Maybe before I respond to that, I just want to add on to a question that had been asked on what are the indicators of economic stability.
Yes.
Yeah, so other than the ones that had been mentioned, there are also issues of political stability. So if a country is stable, in a way, you can say that the economy, because there's a relationship. So currently, the mandamandos have stopped, and we are hoping that the bipartisan talks will yield some good fruits. There's also the issue of infrastructure development. So if you see a lot of infrastructure development, that means the economy is growing. But currently, maybe I can say not much, but we are hoping maybe with the housing levy, we'll see a lot of constructions which will actually spur the economy. There's the issue of the income distribution in Kenya. Currently, the gap between the rich and the poor is still there. So for me, I would still question, are we stable or not? And a very key item is the ease of doing business. So if you look at currently what is happening in Kenya, there's a lot of capital flight because FDI has reduced because nobody feels that, even the locals, we are feeling the environment is not very comfortable. I mean, is not conducive for business. So those are some of the metrics. And for me, I say there we have scored poorly. So that's why I would just have that balance on the issue of are we doing well or not. So you had asked about the issue of the IMF, the debt and all that. So for me, I would say that as much as the president has committed that we are going to pay the debt on time, the question will be, where are these funds coming from? Now, if you look at what is happening locally, the government has done a lot of borrowing in the domestic market. So if you follow the last trades, the last auctions of the treasury bills and bonds, there's been a lot of oversubscription, and the government is actually taking in the bills actually around 1,000% above what they actually targeted. And this is actually, again, pushing the rates. If you look at the TB rates, which help to just give the basic rates of their country in terms of interest, they are now at 13%. All of them, from the 90, 182 days, and I think the 3 full year bills, so they have gone up to 13%. So that means that is the risk-free rate. So any other lending will have a higher rate. if you look at the bonds, what Profiraki was mentioning, the government, actually most of the bids that won last week were at 17%. So it means that the government is still borrowing, but domestically. So as much as we are going to pay the debt, the question should be, where are these funds coming from? Are we borrowing and then paying? But I mean, because for me, we are still not in that debt trap, because our budget, as Rogo had said, we need really to check on our expenses. Otherwise, if we keep looking at the revenue side, we are missing a very important side of the story. Yeah.
All right. I remember there was a lot of speculation when at the time this administration was coming into office. Will Kenya go the Ghana way? You know, but just getting some of your thoughts before Professor X and Iraq, and I will come to you, Wangare, calls me out for not incorporating them. The economy, this is Dismas Muyuga, who says the economy could have stabilized faster if something could have been done on diesel and in long-term investment in irrigation farming coupled with lowering interest rates. Let me see, Humphrey Wabwire Owori says economists have decided to keep their analysis to themselves because sharing with the public will not be well with the government. This is Paul Miner. He asks what is happening to the Kenya shilling. For the last 10 years, it has been spiraling abnormally. Can they address this issue comprehensively and explain factors contributing to this downfall? Let me take a look at some from Twitter. Before we take a look at more from Facebook. Mwalimu Njoroge asks, who of these panelists is, quote, on the ground? Joseph Kariuki says, no, unless we reduce the burden of over-representation. Where is that? No, unless we reduce the burden of over-representation, we remain in a vicious cycle. Derry says during Uhuru era, the economy was stable. Now, not again, look at the dollar. Jesse, economy is not stabilizing on the ground. Things are still tough. It's only government beating chest that they have done something, but that something is not visible on the ground. People are still struggling out here to meet their needs. Jesse will be watching from Eldoret. So, Wangare, the debt, where are we with the debt situation? Because the president says the fact that we're going to pay the Eurobond, he says, ahead of schedule, you know, should indicate that it is contained. But then again, when you look, there are concerns that if they borrow domestically, then local businesses will be locked out, right? I mean, it'll cost the local businesses from accessing credit. And then also there are concerns around the credit that is available in the international financial markets, the terms of which are unfriendly. So are we then forced to just contend with the IMF and their conditions?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one, and I think we have talked about debt so exhaustively, and it keeps changing. And but I think the constant sentiment is that the debt situation is dire. But I also
it remains dire.
Well, the sentiment over the years when we talk about debt, we talk about it in being dire. But I also want to reiterate that debt in itself is not bad, and I think people tend to confuse. Or they've demonized this word debt, right? Debt in itself is inherently not bad, and even us as individual consumers, if I can make a parallel, like if you're going to build a house or you're going to build something that is very capital intensive, you actually go to a bank and get some resources so that you can build that house or invest in that big capital so that you can continue to have, so you're not spending a big chunk of your money up front and you're able to meet your other daily needs as you do in parallel build or invest in the capital and pay it off slowly. And I think if you look at it at the macro scale, that is what Kenya has been doing, where we invest in big infrastructure, for example, the highways, the port, etc., because we understand that if we make these large investments, or our hope is that we make these large investments, we will be able to reap the benefits of those investments in due course. The challenge comes in when we borrow too much, and our repayments take a big chunk of the disposable, if you look at macro disposable income that the government has to pay the daily thing, the regular things in the budget. Budget is annual, we need to pay for education, we need to pay for agriculture, we need to pay for water, all those things. But if you're collecting revenues and half our revenues, even, if it was me, anybody would tell you, even these personal financial advisors, if half of your revenues is going to paying loans and debts, then that is a bad situation. So if we analyze our debt, and we'll start to realize that we're not just borrowing to invest in infrastructure, which is typically what you do. We're borrowing and also starting to pay for salaries and other recurrent costs. If you do that, as I'm sure the listeners know, when you pay for salaries, that money it's not an investment. It doesn't come back, right? And so you can't expect that money, in 10 years to be recouped because that money has gone for consumption, right? So in terms of how we use the money that we get for debt is very important. The issue of who we're lending to, yes, we're lending domestically, so the money is within the country, but we still have to pay back the people within the country. Yes, it's domestic denominated in shillings, so we're not subject to exchange rates, which is a positive thing. But at the same time, if you look at the budget books, the people we're paying back the most money tends to be local citizens. In some ways, because the money is quote unquote retained in the country, it has a opportunity to regenerate and to be used within the economy. But then also when we broke it down, we did analysis some years ago and we looked at who are these domestic borrowers. And sometimes these domestic borrowers are actually not domestic borrowers. They may be large banks that are domiciled here, but they repatriate the profits maybe to another jurisdiction. So that is also an area of concern. So we need to make sure that we keep an eye on debt. We look at its composition. We look where the returns are going. And we also need to make sure that we are not in a constant kind of debt spiral. I hope that, what the president has been saying, and he's talked about debt severally. In almost every speech I hear him talking about debt, so I know it's top of mind, that we are really making the moves to reduce our debt burden and to reduce our exposure, especially to external debt going forward. But I think bottom line, debt is not bad. We just need to make sure that we're managing it well, and that also, as Abraham does and is daily bread, making sure that this is transparent, making sure that those who we're lending to, how much we're lending at, when it is due, where the money is coming from, etc., is made public, and we are able to see that.
All right. Prof, I was looking at some of the comments that we read out, and they're talking about the cost of fuel. So, speaking of government interventions, the president the other day took exception to a report that was filed by Julian Zamboko, Daily Nation, with regard to the Petroleum Development Levy, and he took the view that this is not a subsidy.
That reminds me of another debate he had about the housing levy, when he was saying it's not tax, when he was put to task. But before I respond to that issue about subsidies, somebody asked online, I think Kenya on Twitter, whether we're on the ground.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why we are here is, and I think the reason why you invited us is because you believe we shall talk about the reality on the ground. Yes. Because we interact with ordinary Kenyans.
You are ordinary Kenyans.
But you told us you're not on the ground. That's why you called us here very early in the morning.
Yes.
So that we can come and talk about the solutions for the country's national problems. So for somebody to claim you, to ask whether we're on the ground, that's an unfair question. We're on the ground. In fact, to prove that we're on the ground, I was woken up this morning by my neighbor's cockerel. And economists here will say I'm benefiting from the free rider effect. But we are very realistic people. Now back to your question. I was very surprised when I saw Kenya Kwanza government talking about fuel subsidies. Because from day one, they portray themselves as market economists. We are going to free the market. We are going to make the market work. But I think after 1 year, they have become political realists. So they have realized we have the economic idealism, but we have the political reality. So if the price of fuel starts hitting 200 Kenyan shillings per liter, the voters, the hustlers will be unhappy. So the government must do something to make sure that the prices are stabilized. So I think what is happening to bring back the subsidies, whatever you call them, is the government facing the political reality. And every government faces its moment of truth. My neighbor here, Dr. Rugo, has talked about state-owned enterprises. They should be sold, they should be merged. That's very easy from an economic point of view. But if you're a politician, what jobs are you going to give the people who voted for you, the people who helped you win? You must give them something. So we need a bit of political boldness. And I think the other area of political boldness that we need is the realization that taxes do not always work as expected. Sometimes the economy can grow better if you cut taxes than raising them. Because I'm one of those people who believe that money is used more expeditiously, is used more efficiently.
And you've actually been very consistent in that message.
In private hands than in public hands.
That's true.
So to cut the story short, we need to balance political interest and economic interests. And I can't finish without supporting what my friend is saying. Too much focus on revenue side. Let's also focus on the expenditure side. There are some expenditures we can reduce. So that at the end of the day, we don't need to raise taxes. If you reduce the expenditure, then the deficit will reduce. If the deficit refuses or reduces, there is less need for taxes. And we shall put that money in our pocket and use it. And we shall use it in the right way, and the economy will grow.
Okay. All right, just looking at some more comments from Twitter. Namufweri says, just check your profits. We published those last week. Yeah, so our profits have significantly come down compared to the last half. Let me see. It is rated on how much is your currency selling, so it's not stable. In fact, it is Dieng. Dieng, I assume, is slang for not doing well.
Wangari can interpret Dieng for us.
Simon Ekidor says, huku tunavumilia tu maisha, mahindi karibu yaive. This is Kelvin Ngano who says, kwa grao vitu imestabilize kiasi, but at a high price, we wonder the quality of products nowadays in the market. Cosma says, honestly speaking, mimi sijui inasonga tu. Ukiamua unasema asante God, ukipata ya kula unashukuru God pia, ukiwa na place ya kulala unashukuru tu. That's it. He says, yeah, wanasonga tu. So yes, Prof.
Maybe without dominating here, because there should be some democracy.
Yes, Prof.
I cannot fail to talk about IMF because you have used it. Everybody has used the word IMF
yes.
or the term IMF, and that takes me back a few years ago, when IMF was very dominant in this country, structural adjustment programs and so on in the 80s. And then Kibaki came to power, and we almost never heard about IMF for about 10 years or so. And Kibaki used to talk about najivunia kuwa Mkenya. So when we are paying taxes, we are very happy. Nobody complained. But now we are being told to pay taxes, we are complaining. And I think it's a noble idea that we need to stop relying so much on external debts or external financing, because that's a part of national pride. But I think one of the issues that is not coming very clear in the last 1 year or so is that we have not been convinced exactly where the tax money is going. And I think that's one thing the government needs to do very well. If we are getting taxes from you, this is where it is going. These are the results. And then people will be more than willing to pay taxes. And we stop, as Wangari put it, we stop getting more debt. Because we need to balance debt and the taxes. If you have too much taxes, the economy is depressed because people don't spend. Because one of the areas that drive the economy is the consumption. So I don't know how we are going to balance that, but it is possible to balance the two. I don't want us, you can be sure there's no day we are going to stop talking about debt, either as government or as individuals. The question we should be discussing here is how do we balance so that we don't have too much debt, we don't have too much tax. The current debate now seems to be tax, tax, tax. And that's why we are talking about the third way, focus on reduction in expenditure.
All right, the third way. Okay, not third way alliance, but Abraham, I was listening to Meg Whitman's presentation again at the Devolution conference, and she talked about, these new jobs have been created in the last year, and she said, Kenya Kwanza, just repeat what you did in this last year, next year, and we'll be at a better place. But then I think it's Professor Elizabeth Kalunda correctly pointed out that there have been job losses, and I was listening to her, and I was like, when we are living in two different Kenyas. Your thoughts?
I think it's important for us to appreciate that any job creation right now in the last 2 years is not a new creation it's a recovery. Because in 2020, 2021, we lost so many jobs. So we are not necessarily creating new jobs. You're basically like trying to get back to an equilibrium of sorts. But at the same time, jobs are not jobs unless they are producing incomes that are helping people. You see, you can have a job, but if you still have to hustle after your job to be able to make ends meet, you know, it's a struggle. So statistically, you can count how many people you have employed on your farm. You know, like, you know, head count. One could do that. And a lot of the jobs that were being discussed were largely, you know, within ICT spaces, if I recall correctly. Some of them are projections of, for instance, you know, the different programs for the youth that are being created and the like. But the kind of incomes that are being, you know, produced for that kind of context, I think, beg to question, because then are they incomes that are, I'm not convinced that we have gotten to a point where we have created jobs that are able to sustain people and households as it were. But having said that, the move next, when you think about businesses, again, you recall again, a lot of small businesses closed down. I think the report was figuring about 2 million household-owned businesses closed down, you know, vinyozis and what have you. You walk into a lot of estates, you still find places that are vacant, you know, or closed, because then people are not able to make.
Even downtown.
Even downtown here, just across here, you still find enough stalls that are either closed or people trying to patch up together in that. At the same time, because a lot of, for instance, the goods we use, the products we use for those businesses are imported, and with the new taxation regime that is basically taxing almost item by item, or you know, in small quantities, as it were, you find more and more people complaining, I'm not able to run my business anymore. So that tells you that there's still more work to be done to make sure, first of all, the cost of doing business and the environment, as it were, is much better. I listened to her. I was at the conference, and I thought perhaps there's much more conversation that needs to be held of the kinds of jobs being created. So counting headcount is not necessarily a good thing in and of itself. And the president also repeated and said, we want to create more jobs. I think there's a lot of work to be done. But for that to happen, you need to be creating an environment, because jobs are not created by public sector. They are not created by government. The assumption that government can create different structures and engineer certain programs to be able to, government only intervenes well when there is a pure crisis and it's for short term, you know, when you an economic stimulus of sorts. But then private sector then has to take up and be able to run in terms of the long term of it. The same private sector is what we are saying is really being affected by very high taxes, very high cost of doing business, high cost of setting up business. I think the lawyers I've talked to tell you just how tedious that process is of setting up a proper business, not mentioning the number of people who also want to be facilitated to facilitate you in that process. But I wanted to say something on debt, because you had asked me earlier. I think all debt is not bad debt, but the debt situation we are in right now is bad. And these are my reasons. When government borrows at 17%, a private entity will have to borrow at 20%. What business or more? What business are you doing? If you have to borrow, if you have to pay an interest rate at 20%, what business are you doing? You go to a bank right now, you know, and I dare anyone on this panel to just go and try and negotiate a loan right now. They are not bothered, because really, government is already giving us serious returns. No bank has posted losses. They may have posted lower profits, but none has posted like proper losses, because now government is borrowing, you know, and government is borrowing from those banks through those. So for me, that's the biggest part of. Secondly, at 17%, Ghana is now borrowing at 24%. I think the last I checked, and we seem to be following in the track of Ghana, like really, you know, chasing them down the street and saying, you guys did not have it good. We want to have it proper, you know, because our biggest risk right now is not external debt. External debt only to the extent of the fluctuation of the dollar. Our biggest risk is our domestic debt. because domestic debt at the 17% rate, anything happening within the economy and you are not able to pay it, of course, we will pay the Eurobond. It's within even the budget. But by paying the Eurobond and paying all these other amounts, including our local debt, you sweep off about 67% of your projected revenue, because it's about 1.625 trillion against an expected revenue of 2.5 trillion. And that is a projected revenue, please remember. But the 1.625 will not change, will not go down, because that's, and also that figure, for instance, of the Eurobond is a factor of the exchange rate, because we borrowed in euros, in dollars, sorry, in dollars. So for me, I'm saying right now where our debt situation is a crisis. It is not a good one, you know, and that's why I think even the panelists here are saying, and I strongly believe, it's time to have a conversation on what we do with our expenditure side in the meantime, so that we can be able to go over the cliff, as it were. Because as I'm saying, you're not going to change how much you are paying in your debt right now. Because our biggest problem right now is not that we are borrowing more, is that we have to pay what we already borrowed. And because that must be paid, it's a first charge to the consolidated fund. The only way to manage it right now is either try some restructuring. The president has committed will pay the Eurobond. So 1.625 trillion or 160 out of your 250. 250 is projected. It may be 240, it may be 230. I pray it will be 250. You know, 250 as in Kenya shillings. I'm just using a smaller figure that we can relate to. So that's for me the concern. And because you cannot change how much you will pay in terms of servicing, the only hope right now is addressing the expenditure side, so that then we go over the cliff.
Okay. All right, let me get your final remarks. Professor Elizabeth Kalunda and Wangare, how do we build on this momentum? If indeed this tanker is now pointing in the right direction, how do we build on that?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Olivia. So for me, I think the direction that we should go, as a country, we should try to reduce our dependence on exports, or sorry, on imports, because that's where the demand for dollar is actually coming in, because we have to pay in that currency. So as a country, I think we have to look critically in terms of how do we improve our country from a primary producer of agricultural products to now a producer to another level, so that instead of producing raw tea, because I was looking at what has been happening, the prices have gone up, instead of just producing the primary tea, they just tea as the product, why can't we add value on it so that we are able to export at a higher value? Again, the other thing that has been coming up is the issue of maybe if you look at the papers we were looking at today, there was the issue of the diaspora remittance. Yeah, so that is a way of bringing the dollars. Because I'm looking at this now from how can we try to stabilize our currency. Now, if you look at the remittances, they have gone up. But again, the question will be, the people who are receiving these remittances, what are they doing? Are they for consumption? So if they are basically for consumption, it will just mean that their food basket will be a bit cushioned, but in terms of development, that is not going to be the case. So for me, what I would say is that as a country, let's focus on creating jobs that have value. Let us focus on adding value to whatever we have. And the other issue is on tourism. I was just looking at what has been happening in the economy, and there's been a lot of local tourism. Last week, if you looked at the SGR, it was fully booked because families had all gone to Mombasa. So that in a way promotes the tourist, but we are not getting the dollar. So let's make the country conducive so that we can have the tourists coming in and bringing the dollar that we need. Otherwise, we'll always be in that deficit in terms of the balance of payment, in terms of the dollar reserve that we have. Yeah, so I think, and probably now with the new CBK chairman, I hope that is the direction to improve our forex reserves. Otherwise, we'll always be in this cycle of debt and our currency always depreciating. Yeah, these are my final thoughts around that.
Wangari?
Right, just to close, I wanted to highlight three things and then close from there. I think number one, just a quick comment on the question of the IMF. You know, the IMF tends to be a very technical organization, and their propositions are technical in their delivery and in how they want it to impact in a country. But countries, on the other hand, have to contend with the administrative part and the political part. So in as much as the IMF come and people are saying, oh, we're following the IMF, direction, or, I hate to say conditionalities, but conditionalities, it is a signal that maybe technically we're doing the right thing, but internally we still have to contend with a lot of political and administrative things that may find us not always following the IMF direction. So if we should use the IMF as a barometer in a way, but we shouldn't use them, as was said earlier, as we're just blindly following, because then we do have a problem there. And I remember there was once we did have an engagement with the IMF, and I think the predominant sentiment to them was that, there are a lot of structural macroeconomic problems in the country, but whenever they come and they do their reviews, they always give a good thumbs up and a tick, and you're like, well, are we, which government were you looking at? Because as far as I'm concerned, there were some problems. So we do have we don't have a very clear understanding of how the IMF is functioning, but also they are a very technical organization we need to think about. The second thing is about, you talked about Meg Whitman, and in her presentation, she was very excited about Kenya. And I was like, oh, where is this place? Even me, I want to invest in this place. Huh? What is going on? So, I mean, it was very exciting, but she did mention, in her excitement, and because it was a devolution conference, she couldn't stand there essentially and kind of, put a damper on the conversation. But she did mention, in as much as she tried to not talk about it much, was the tax policy. And she said, if you're going to create an environment that's conducive for business, you have to make sure that you have a stable tax policy. Yes. Over the years, we can agree that our taxes have been all over the place. And I think if we were able to institute that, I think that would take us a long way forward. And speaking about what Abraham was talking about, in terms of the expenditure side, if I'm going to pay high taxes, and Kenya is not the place where the highest taxes are paid. We can all agree that. In some of the Nordic countries, they pay crazy amounts. But they also get very good service delivery. So if you're talking about the expenditure side, yes, I'm happy to pay the tax rates. But if you're giving me education that's commensurate to what I would have been paying in my personal capacity, then I would be feeling positive about where my shilling is going. But if I don't get those services that are commensurate to what I would have been paying if you had let me keep my little shillings in my pocket, then I have a challenge, right? If I don't have regular electricity, I don't have regular water, if my children are not going to the right schools, that becomes a problem. So we're happy to take taxes in as long as we get the right goods and services delivered to us, especially with the economies of scale that is experienced. And the last thing, because I think we always tend to really, sometimes we talk always negative about government, and we're always like Debbie Downers if it were. But there's some things that the government is doing and giving us signals that that things can be better, and they're giving us opportunities to do more. So for example, in the Finance Act, allowing inputs for manufacturing to come in at lower or zero rated tax rates, I think is important. We have a great new deal, the economic partnership agreement with the EU that allows us access to the whole EU, a huge market, so allows us to prop up our manufacturing to be able to serve this. And then also America, I know, is hot on the heels of this. They're going to reform, AGOA had its own problems, but I know there's going to be a new agreement from this perspective. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And the Finance Act is allowing us to prop up our manufacturing so that we can be ready to serve these large markets that now we are open to.
All right, sorry about that, Wangari. They're sending me a signal that it's time I make way for your world. But I've had in studio, you've heard from Wangari Mwikia, who is a public finance management specialist, expertise global. We will correct that next time. We've also had in studio Dr. Abraham Rugo, country manager, International Budget Partnership, Kenya. Professor Elizabeth Kalunda, associate professor, USIU Africa, also chair Department of Accounting, Finance and Economics, Chandaria Business School, and Professor Exen, Iraqi economist, columnist, lecturer. Mwalimu wa kila mtu. Everybody comes here. Prof was my lecturer. My name is Olive Burrows. You've been watching AM Live. Yes. It's not an easy question to answer, questions to do with the economy, because there are very many factors that come into play. But I do appreciate your efforts this morning to attempt to answer this question. Your world, as I said, with Winnie Lubembe coming up next.
Spot on! Spot on!
Checkmate, spot on.
Wow, spot on.
Catch Spot On every Monday night from 10 p.m. on NTV and every Saturday afternoon from 3 p.m. on Nation FM. Nation Media Group, the home of sport.
Spot On in association with DSTV.
Dial *423# or download my DSTV app to get a DSTV HD decoder with 1 month of family for just 2,999 Kenya shillings. It's the Premier League on DSTV.
Precious, you are to me. Love unending and conditional. Provision I see, protection I get. So I sing out a song to you alone.
To get Precious as your Skiza tune, dial *811*930#.
Skiza, non-nation.
You need the trunk?
No, I'll be taking it with me.
Sure.
Follow her. Your spies. They're confused about everything.
You're jeopardizing the whole family. You were explicitly told not to.
What's that? Really?
Misha, are you busy? We need to talk right now.
Get out.
Sammy!
Just ensure that Moose dies.
Nini?
Donga amepasture huyo mtu.
Z, nenda kuona padre. Padre yako Kenya?
Staki noma. Kazi kwa na ngori.
This is where you're throwing money down the drain.
How?
On these cleaning products.
Impossible.
Harpic 10X. While other cleaners flow away, Harpic 10X's viscous formula in only one round of application gives you sparkling, clean toilet. Harpic, 10 times better cleaning than other cleaning products.
And great savings too.
Just look at how your boyfriend ended up, honey. He'll be asleep for quite a while. Tell me what you think we should do with the time we'll have.
I'm begging you to hear me out. I want to tell you what happened so that,
So that what? So that I can forgive you? I don't want to hear anything!
Head over heels. In every corner of Africa, leaders rise. From corporate pioneers to sports champions, innovative minds, and creative souls. You are the leaders of tomorrow, and we want to celebrate you. Are you a leader in your pack? Nominate yourself or someone you know for this year's Top 40 Under 40 and be part